Hi, my name is Emily Shea. I'm a Senior Partner Development Manager with AWS. In this talk, I'm going to be walking through building and evolving one of my first serverless web applications and sharing some of the things that helped me learn to build serverless along the way. One of my favorite things about working in the technology industry is that you get to be surrounded by people who love to learn and love to problem solve, and it's a great environment to be a part of. The only issue that I can see with loving to problem solve is that it feels like there's never enough time in the day. If you're like me, you'll end up with a long backlog of ideas that you'd love to get to. Maybe that's a feature on a product that you're building, a side project that you're really excited about, or maybe even a new company idea. And it just feels like you're never able to get to all of them. Today, I'm going to be talking about how serverless allows you to experiment with ideas more frequently, build your applications faster, and take more of those ideas that are sitting in your backlog and make them a reality. To do this, I'm going to be walking through one of the first serverless applications that I built, taking you from the ideation phase, so thinking about the design of the application and what I wanted it to do, through the architecture decisions that I made and choosing which AWS services to use, and finally sharing some of the tips and resources that helped me as I was learning to build serverless. So to start off with a little background, if you caught my job title in the first slide, you might have been wondering why a partner development manager is giving a talk on building serverless applications. So just to share a little background on that, my background is actually originally in Chinese. So I've studied Chinese language for many years, and I went to grad school at Nanjing University. After Nanjing, I came back to Seattle and got really interested in AWS. I started learning about cloud computing and working on my AWS certifications and learning to code in the process, and just really enjoying getting hands-on with AWS services. I started with AWS in my current role about 2 years ago. I'm a partner development manager, and I work with our awesome community of serverless technology partners, and I still really enjoy building serverless applications in my free time. So while I was learning about AWS and really getting into cloud computing, I was spending a lot of time on that, but not really spending much time on my Chinese, and I started to feel it getting a little rusty. Maybe if you have a second language or a skill that you haven't used in a while, you'll be familiar with that feeling of just feeling like things are a little harder to remember than maybe they once were. And so that's where I was at with Chinese. The inspiration for the app that I'm going to talk about today was just wanting to work regular reminders to study Chinese back into my daily routine. So the application idea that I had is really pretty straightforward. I just wanted to build a web application that would allow me to send daily emails with Chinese vocabulary at my level to myself. But I wanted to challenge myself, and I wanted to make it a public service, so make it available to anyone that wanted to subscribe and get daily emails. And so that's where some of the complexity of the app comes in. In order to build this application, I'm going to need a couple pieces. First off, I'm going to need a user-facing website. So I'm going to need a place for users to come onto and then to subscribe or unsubscribe and just use the service in that way. Next, I'm going to need something for a backend for contact management. So I'll need a place to store those email lists and the Chinese level that those users are subscribed to. Third, I'm going to need storage for passwords. So the experience that I wanted is I wanted users to be able to review the words they've seen over the past week or the past month. And so I'm going to need to be able to store those daily words that I'm sending out. And then lastly, once I've got a few subscribers, I'd like to be able to do some analytics and just be able to get some insights into that aggregate subscriber base. So those are all the components that I'm going to need to be able to build this application. So I'd like to take a minute and just talk about why I chose serverless to build this application. Just thinking about the highest level of definition of serverless in my mind, it's just taking some of that undifferentiated work of building an application and handing it over to AWS to automate and to manage for you. And that gives you more time to focus on what makes your application unique. So digging into that a little bit more, maybe you've built on servers or virtual machines before, and you'll be familiar with some of the work that goes into managing those underlying servers. So that can involve spinning up the servers, installing software on the operating system, patching that operating system, and so on. And with serverless, if you're building on serverless, all of that work goes away. You just upload your code, and you never think about any of the underlying servers or the maintenance tasks that go along with those. If you built on servers, you'll also be familiar with some of the challenges of just deciding how many servers to spin up and what size those servers should be. especially if you're experimenting with a new idea and you're not really sure where it's going to go, whether it's going to kind of take off or what that usage is going to be. If you spin up too few servers and there's a traffic spike, then you're going to run into some issues when users are trying to reach that website and they're not able to, and so there's a negative experience for your users on that side. Alternatively, if you spin up too many servers, then you're going to run into the issue of just paying for unused capacity. And so there's really issues on both sides there. And both of those they go away when you're using serverless. And so now you're not needing to make any decisions about capacity up front. You're just uploading your code, and the underlying infrastructure will scale up for you if traffic surges, and you're able to handle that well. But then importantly, it'll also scale back down. So if, say, it's an off season, or maybe there's no traffic to your application on the weekends, in that case, you're not paying for it, and so you're only paying when your code is invoked, and you're getting a lot of value out of it in that way as well. So maybe you're coming from a background where you've built on servers before, and you're looking to take some of those tasks and hand them over to AWS, and just be able to focus on the application itself. Or maybe you're more like me and you're newer to building applications, and you just want to take the coding skills that you have and not need to learn about server maintenance. In either way, serverless is going to be really beneficial to you. It's going to allow you to experiment more and to just build faster by having more time to focus on what makes your application unique and what you're building yourself. So now let's jump into the development walkthrough. So I'm just going to be walking through the evolution of my application architecture. And I'm also going to be sharing some of the concepts that I think are helpful to keep in mind and just some of the things that helped me as I was learning. The first thing to keep in mind while you're building serverless applications is that they are structured around event-driven workflows. So when you're building a serverless application, you'll have an event. That event will trigger a workflow, and that workflow will do something with that event data. Thinking about common types of events that you might be using, maybe you have a user that reaches a website and clicks a button on that website. Maybe you've got a scheduled event, so something that runs on a regular cadence. Maybe that's every week, every day, or even every second. And then finally, maybe you have a file that gets uploaded and you do something with that file. So all these are really common events that you can kind of structure an application around. So this is the most basic version of my application architecture, and this is just implementing that really basic sending email functionality. So first off, I've got an Amazon Event Bridge event, and I've scheduled this to run on a daily cadence. So I want this to send every day at noon. I've got that Event Bridge event triggering a Lambda function. And AWS Lambda functions, they're kind of the core compute of serverless applications, and it's where your code and your business logic will live. And so the Lambda function, it goes into an Amazon Simple Storage Service bucket, or S3 bucket. And in that bucket, I've got my full list of Chinese vocab words that I could potentially be sending, and it pulls out a random word for that level that it's sending out. Next, it uses Amazon Simple Email Service, or SES, to send those emails. So really super basic at this stage, just 4 services. And let's click into that Lambda function and just take a look at kind of the code that we've got here. Really straightforward at this point. This is all the code that I would need with a comment where I would be adding a little additional code to just to power the application at this stage. And so I've written in with this Lambda function in Python. So first off, it's going to import Boto3, the Python SDK. Next, it's going to instantiate the SES client, so just making sure that we can use SES to send emails. Next, I've got my Lambda handler, and the Lambda handler is going to be invoked every time that the function is invoked. And I've got a comment where I would be pulling that Chinese vocab word that I'm going to be sending for the day from S3. The bulk of the application code or the function code at this point is really just sending that email, so going through the email address list that I've got and sending emails out. And then lastly, just a bit of error handling. And so it's really straightforward at this point, just the amount of code that we need to get this application up and running. So I've got the daily email send working well. The only issue at this point with the application is that if I want to add a new user to the subscription, I need to manually add their email address to a list. And so ideally, the next step that I like to take with the application is to be able to allow create a front end so that they can subscribe or unsubscribe themselves. To do that, I'm going to need APIs. So an API, or an application programming interface, You can think of this as the front door to your application. And this is where your front-end website or users using your front end can take actions on the back end. Different actions that they could take, they could create, update, or delete data, or they could retrieve data, and all that's done through APIs. A good way to introduce APIs is just to think about the different touch points on the front end of your application that you might need an API to back up. So here I've got a screenshot of the homepage of my application. And the first touch point that we've got is I've got a form where this is where users subscribe. So first off, I've got a field where you can enter your Chinese level. Then I've got a field where you can enter your email address, and then a subscribe button. And so when users hit that subscribe button, I want to take an action on the back end. So this is the back end for that API. I'm using Amazon API Gateway for my APIs. And then I've got a Lambda function, see the subscribe Lambda function, and that backs up the subscribe endpoint for my API. And what that subscribe function is going to do is it's going to write that contact data to an Amazon DynamoDB table, and that's the table that I'm using to store all of my contacts in. And then the next is going to use SES just to send a confirmation email out. I've also got here an unsubscribe endpoint, where I've got an unsubscribe Lambda function that's going to, when users reach the unsubscribe page, which I didn't show you, they're going to hit a button, and that will take them to this endpoint that will remove their contact data from the DynamoDB table. The next touch point that I've got on my homepage is some of the experience that I want users to have when they reach the page. Maybe they're interested in the service, but they're not quite sure which Chinese level they should subscribe to. I'd like to be able to show them some example words that they can say, oh, I think maybe I'm at more of a Chinese level 2 than I am a level 3, and kind of self-assess themselves. And so in order to do that, I'm going to need an API that retrieves some sample words for each level. So this is the backend for two of my APIs that retrieve data. The first one, the sample vocab endpoint, that one I've got a Lambda function that just goes to that S3 bucket and pulls 5 random words for each level to be able to show that kind of sample vocab data. Another UI that I've got that I didn't show is just that functionality of allowing users to review passwords that they've seen. So that daily word history endpoint is allowing users to go on and just see a list of words that they've seen over the past week or the past month. And that pulls from a DynamoDB table where I'm writing each daily word. So these are both APIs that retrieve data for users. So now that I've got my API set up, the last thing I'm going to do is need to host that front-end content somewhere. And so I'm going to use AWS Amplify, and this is going to host all of that static content. So the JavaScript, the HTML, and CSS that makes up my front-end website. The cool thing about using AWS Amplify is that it also allows us to take advantage of AWS's Global Content Delivery Network, or CDN. And what the CDN does is it takes all of our static content and it hosts it in a location that's closest to wherever the user's coming from. And so whenever a user hits our website, they're going to have a really fast and low latency experience. Awesome. So I've got my emails getting sent out on a daily basis. I've got an automated way for users to go in and subscribe or unsubscribe themselves. And I'm also allowing them to review passwords. So there's a lot of functionality going on here at this point. I actually have seen a lot more traction than I expected to on the application. And so the next thing that I want to do is I want to be able to get some insights into the kind of aggregate subscriber base. I want to see how many subscribers I have, if everyone is immediately unsubscribing afterwards, and just kind of get some insights into it there. This gets to one of my other favorite things about serverless, which is just the fact that it's really easy to start small and just continue to add complexity over time. So all of the components that I built so far are really reusable. It's really easy to kind of extend and go whatever direction your application might take you, which is awesome if we're thinking about using serverless to experiment with new ideas and to just kind of see where things take us. And so in a lot of cases, in the next case that I'm going to show you, you just won't need to make any code changes to the existing application as it stands. So this is the backend that I'm going to need for the analytics dashboard that I built. So just to walk through this, first off, I've got another Amazon EventBridge event. This time this runs on a weekly basis. And so I've got it set up so that every Friday my reporting data will refresh. that is going to trigger a Lambda function. And the Lambda function is going to go to that DynamoDB table that I'm using for my contact management, and it's going to do a full scan of that table. So just get all of the data on the subscribers for that week. Next, it's going to save that data in an S3 bucket. And then it's going to use that S3 bucket as the data source for an Amazon QuickSight dashboard. So QuickSight is a data visualization tool that we can use to create graphs and get insights about the data that we're storing. And so here's the QuickSight dashboard that I've got. I just can see some really cool things right off the bat here. So I can see that I had a big spike in subscribers in January. I can see that I've got 91 unique active subscribers. I'm not super surprised to find that the unsubscribe rate is highest for level 1. And so my assumption is there that people kind of go onto the homepage, they'll maybe subscribe to level 1 just to see how it is and then unsubscribe. But then the unsubscribe rate is lower for the higher level, so people stick around if they're a higher level of Chinese. So just some cool insights that I'm able to gather, and all that was out without making a single code change to my base application. Just thinking ahead into other directions that I might take the application and things that I'm interested in building. First off is just being able to reuse that existing word history API that I've got, so the one where I'm storing every daily word so people can review words that they've seen. And I actually built this recently where I took the output of that API, just wrote some JavaScript and created a front end for a new UI, and so that users can generate quizzes for themselves. So it just shuffles up that data that's coming from that API and creates a quiz interface. And so that was an additional feature that I was able to do without making any code changes to the back end. Another feature that I'm excited about is just adding the ability for user profiles, so people can sign in and get a little personalization. I'd like to be able to kind of track how many quizzes that a user has taken, and maybe add a little element of competition with quiz leaderboards. And in order to do that, I'm going to need some authentication. So I'd need to add an auth service like Amazon Cognito to my application, and just to be able to build that on. But a lot of different directions that you can take an application, and it's nice to be able to reuse components and just extend an application, which Serverless lets you do. So this is the full application architecture that I've got today. Super cool to see that it's grown from just a single Lambda function to a lot of different features and functionality. And by far my favorite thing about this is just how fast I was able to get this up and running and providing value to people. Just with kind of the limited technical background that I've been able to build, and I think Serverless has really enabled that. So the last thing that I'd like you to leave you with is kind of a tip that I think helped me be successful, is just to emphasize the value of setting up an automated development workflow. So a lot of people like myself included, will get started learning a new AWS service, playing around with it in the AWS console. So maybe you're setting up a Lambda function or writing some code for that function, setting up an API gateway API, and you're doing it all directly in the AWS console. This is a great way to get familiar with a new service and just kind of play around with it. But I think you'll start to run into some of the drawbacks of editing your resources directly in the console pretty quickly. Maybe you make a small change to your function code and you forget about it, and it's causing a bug down the line, and you're having to kind of go back and track and figure out where that bug is coming from. And so it's kind of hard to keep some of the consistency and just be sure that you know where all the changes you've made are. The way to resolve this issue is just to set up that automated development workflow that I mentioned. And what that workflow looks like is it's just having the ability to make changes to your function code and your resources within your text editor, and to save those changes and deploy them to the AWS cloud consistently and smoothly every time. Just having this process set up will make you so much more productive. It'll make your deployments consistent and allow you to publish new iterations of your application quickly, and overall just maximize your development speed. So this is an example of a simple serverless continuous integration, continuous deployment, or CI/CD pipeline. And I'm just going to walk through each component of that and just tell you a little bit about what they do. So first step is we're working our text editor and we're defining, we're writing our function code, and then we're also defining our resources using a serverless development framework. And what a framework does for you is it allows you to write and to configure your AWS resources that make up your application using code. So any of your function settings, your API gateway APIs, DynamoDB tables, all these are going to be written out in a framework. And so every time you deploy, you're deploying the resources consistently, and you know, and you kind of review that framework and be sure that you're deploying the same thing every time. And so there's a lot of benefit to defining your resources as infrastructure as code. Once you've gotten your function code written, your resources defined in a framework template, the next step is uploading all that code to a repository. So a repository, something like AWS Code Commit could be used for this, is just where you store your source code for your application and all the previous iterations of that source code. So you can go back to a previous iteration and just generally keep a tight lock on the source code for your application. Once new code is uploaded to that repository, it'll trigger a new build in your deployment tool, or I'm using AWS Code Pipeline in this example. And the deployment tool, that will create a new build of your application. It'll run any tests that you might have, maybe unit tests for your function code. And then finally, it'll deploy that code to AWS. I know when I was first looking at this and thinking about setting up my own workflow, it seemed like potentially a lot of tools to kind of string together. But just from a productivity and a consistency perspective, it absolutely makes sense, even for really small applications. Anything that you want to maintain over time, this will be really helpful for your development workflow. And just to show you an example of what that framework can look like, here's an example of a template that I've got. And this is using the AWS Serverless Application Model, or AWS SAM, which is a framework that you can use for this. And so in this example, I'm just defining a really simple application similar to the one that I talked about, only this one sends daily text messages. And so under resources, I've got my Lambda function. I've got a event bridge event. This one's scheduled to run on a daily cadence. And then I've also got a comment at the bottom where I would include my simple notification service topic, or my SNS topic, to send those texts. One thing that I'd like to point out here is that the framework actually does some cool stuff for me, and it kind of simplifies my development workflow. So one thing that it does, if you look under resources and see the policies that I've got there, I'm attaching an SNS publish message policy. And what that does is it attaches the IAM policy, or the permissions that my function is going to need in order to use SNS to send text messages. And so I'm able to attach that and just define that within 3 lines there. And then also at the bottom, of course, I've got the event attached to my Lambda function, and that's just setting up the event that's going to trigger this function. And so the event is just attached onto the bottom there. So finally, just to recap the getting started tips that I've shared, first off, you can absolutely feel free to start small, and my application started from just a simple Lambda function. So starting small and increasing the complexity of your application over time is super doable with serverless, just with that extensibility and reusability of the components that you've already got. Next, be sure to think in terms of event-driven workflows. So as you're defining your application, think about the event that you're going to use to trigger the workflow, and then think about the workflow and what that's going to do with the event data, and kind of structure your application around events and workflows. Third, just keeping feature extensibility in mind, and in order to do so, just making sure that your APIs are super well defined. So those APIs that you're using to take actions on your back end, making sure that you're really clear on the inputs and outputs to those APIs so that you can reuse them in the future. And then finally, I talked a bit about the value of setting up an automated development workflow, and just giving yourself that consistency and that speed boost that a workflow like that will do for you. Yeah, so, and finally, I'll leave you with some resources. These are, I've gathered up some related tutorials, so a lot of kind of getting started tutorials for all the services that are used within the Daily Chinese Vocab app. A lot of these are the ones that I used as I was getting started with them. And these are available at Serverless Land, so serverlessland.com/reinvent2020/SVS202. I've also got a QR code here for, so if you want to just screenshot that, that'll take you right there. And then also I've left the links for the Chinese Vocab app if you just want to see what it looks like in practice. I've got the homepage there that I was showing some screenshots from. And then I've also got a repository, so all of the code for this application is open source, so it's available for you to check out there. And of course, I should mention the project is my own and not affiliated with AWS or Amazon, but feel free to check it out. Thank you and happy building.